Well, it's the most important question that any democracy has, which is how do you change government without changing your regime, without changing your constitution, without causing instability? Often it's more important to have a decision than the right decision, because you just need to make a decision one way or the other. Well, I think there is a saying in the UK that politicians should under-promise and over-deliver. The skills you need to run an electoral campaign and win a campaign are very different to the skills you need when you're in office. In a way, you need three sets of people. You need campaign people, transition team, and the people who run your country with you or your state afterwards. And sometimes those skills are very different. And the chief of staff for a campaign may not be the chief of staff that you need for your transition or when you're in government. So you need someone who's prepared to make staffing decisions, to hire people and make unpopular decisions. You have to know not just what your policies are, but what your priorities are. And everyone in your government has to share the same priorities. It's no good the minute that you become the governor or the president. If your team all has different priorities, it's a disaster. And then the last thing, while I'm on a roll here, the structure you set up within your team has to be able to produce a decision.
Stuart Wood é graduado em Filosofia, Política e Economia, PhD em Governo, membro do parlamento britânico e por todas essas competências é também o coordenador do módulo internacional do Master em Liderança e Gestão Pública após graduação do Centro de Liderança Pública. Hoje eu converso com o Stuart sobre o tema Transição de Governo, o jeito britânico de fazer transição. So, Stuart, thank you very much for your availability to have this conversation.
It's a delight to be here. Really happy to be here.
Thank you very much. Stuart, the subject of government transition for CLP, it's very important because for us it's very related with the state capacity of sustain some public policies. So for us to warm up our conversation, what is the importance of this subject for the public policies and how do you see this in the UK government?
Well, it's the most important question that any democracy has, which is how do you change government without changing your regime, without changing your constitution, without causing instability? And in a funny way, the best transitions are ones that no one ever talks about. So the first job of a transition is to keep stability going. But also, often transitions come after elections that are divisive. And you've had an election in Brazil that's been very divisive, as had the United States. In my country, we have the Brexit debate about leaving the European Union, which is very divisive. I think transitions are a chance to try and build bridges between groups that have been attacking each other. And I think the third thing on public policy is a transition like the one you have in Brazil is very important. You have 2 months or 3 months maybe to prepare a policy agenda. And I think the thing that elected politicians don't realize sometimes is once you start your job of being president or governor or representative, you don't have space to think, to reflect, to plan, to have a strategy. The transition is a crucial time to have a strategic approach to the next few years that you'll never get again. And so I think the transition is an opportunity to have a plan and for a plan then to be communicated properly before the crises begin and the resignations happen and everything else takes over.
And how do you do it in the UK?
We do it very badly in the UK. We have an election and the next day the entire government leaves and a new government arrives. There is no transition. That's partly because we have a parliamentary system, not like your presidential system. But because we have this very, very dramatic change where the Prime Minister loses and then 6 hours later the Prime Minister is leaving their office forever. Because we have that, we prepare before the election much more than you do. So in our system, the officials in departments meet with the opposition party for 6 weeks or 7 weeks before the election in meetings. So the environment minister and the opposition party, or the shadow minister as we call it, will meet with the officials in the environment ministry and plan an agenda in case they win. So it's a very different system where we have no transition time, but we have much more preparation time while the campaigns are going on.
So you start a process of dialogue and conversations between the candidates before. Given the differences between the way we do transition in Brazil and the way you do transition in your country, do you believe that starting the process of dialogue, the conversations before, it's more like there is more enforcement, there is more strength in this buildings, or no, our process like doing the way of we have 3 months of transition with a process which is really a step-by-step and coordinated process. What are the gains of each one of them?
Well, I think the gains of the British system, where you have conversations with officials even before the election, it means that officials have time to plan what they're going to do if that party wins. So they know in quite a lot of detail what the party wants to do, the opposition party or whoever it might be. And those conversations are confidential. They don't get out to the public, so only the officials know. So it's quite interesting. Officials in a state are talking to an opposition party with the blessing of the government, which is the other party. It's a very strange system. So the advantage is it gives you planning time as an official. But in your system, you have planning time because you have this 2 months or 3 month gap between the election and the inauguration or the change of Congress, which is a bit longer, I think, here. And I think that is a good model. I mean, you follow the model a bit like the American model. And I think having that 3 months when you know the outcome of the elections, you know who's won, and then the candidate has the responsibility of developing some policy ideas beyond the campaign, because campaigns are usually just slogans and words rather than details. And I think having that time when the whole country is focused on a gradual goodbye to the old president, hello to the new one, I think if it goes well, that's a very good system. And my understanding is, whatever your view of the new president here in Brazil, that this time there's more professionalism about the transition than ever before, at least at the federal level. I guess the challenge for you have so many elected offices at regional level as well, governors and state level, and I think having a more professional transition process in that at that level is a really important challenge, and that's where I know CLP is very interested in adding value.
And keeping in mind those levels of states and municipalities, in your point of view, what are the key points that every government, every politician, every public leader must keep in mind in this process of incoming and outcoming of governments?
Well, lots of things. I mean, the first thing is the skills you need to run an electoral campaign and win a campaign are very different to the skills you need when you're in office. In a way, you need 3 sets of people. You need campaign people, transition team, and the people who run your country with you or your state afterwards. And sometimes those skills are very different. And the chief of staff for a campaign may not be the chief of staff that you need for your transition or when you're in government. So you need someone who's prepared to make staffing decisions, to hire people and make unpopular decisions. That's the first thing. Second thing is you only get one chance, I think, in this transition period at looking at the way departments and agencies work and starting to think maybe changes need to be made, because you have complete authority at the minute you come in to make those changes, which 2 years later you may not have if events go against you or your politics is unpopular. So if you have this moment of power to make the changes of the architecture, if you like, of the way your government works, and of course that's what the President-elect Bolsonaro is doing now. And then a third thing I think is you have to know not just what your policies are, but what your priorities are. And everyone in your government has to share the same priorities. It's no good the minute that you become the governor or the president, if your team all has different priorities, it's a disaster. And then the last thing, while I'm on a roll here, the structure you set up within your team has to be able to produce a decision. And that sounds like an obvious thing to say, but there are so many offices around presidents and prime ministers and ministers that are incapable of actually getting a decision in good time. And putting some effort into the structure of that, of the team that can generate a decisive decision, that's a very important thing in any politician. Often it's more important to have a decision than the right decision, because you just need to make a decision one way or the other, and that's an important thing.
About decisions and about priorities, you talked about the priorities. When is the best time for the incoming government to set the priorities? Is it during the campaign or on the go of the transition period?
Well, I think it's in phases. In the campaign, usually you identify one or two themes that you hate about the current government or that you will prioritize, like crime for Mr. Bolsonaro, for example. But you don't usually get much further than that. But you get a sense of the big theme. Once you're in transition, it's your chance to say, for each department, what are the one or two priority areas going to be? But I think you have to wait until the third phase, when you're in government, to look at the money. Because you need to look at the budgets before you really can have a sense of what you can do and you can't do. For example, I know in your country a huge issue is social security reform, pensions in this country. It is in every country, right? But it's a big problem here. The actual numbers, you're going to have to be in government before you see those numbers, before you know what the economy is likely to be like for the next year or so. So that level of detail, you have to wait, I think. So I think it's like gradually unfolding from a campaign which is very big brush, like a big canvas, to a transition when you have priorities, and then more detail when you're in government.
When we are setting priorities, the government is setting priorities, there is a risk of do not attend to some expectations generated in the public during the campaign. So you have to take some tough decisions.
Yeah.
What tips could you give for ours, even the politicians that are incoming and the public leaders, the public managers, about this expectations alignments or disalignments and alignments?
Well, I think there is a saying in the UK that politicians should under-promise and over-deliver. And when you're in a campaign, you over-promise as a politician. You promise everything to everyone. And that's one of the reasons people don't trust politicians. But the minute you win, I think you have a duty to start to reverse that. So I think one of the good things about a transition period is it can be a period when you show the voters that you're listening, that you're responding to them. And that helps build a little bit more trust, I think. But I think in the first few months, you have a short period when you can be very honest about what you cannot do. And I think it's refreshing. I think if you wait for 2 or 3 years and then you say, I'm sorry, I can't do the thing I promised, people will be more angry. If you say it up front, if you say at the beginning of your time in office, these are my 4 priorities. These other things are important, but these are the 4 things I want you to judge me by. That, I think, is a much better way of managing expectations. Just limit your presidency or your governorship to 2 or 3 issues that you are going to promise to make progress on. For me, that's the best way of managing expectations.
Perfect. Stuart, we have an expression of the first 100 days of government, which are the first days to take tough decisions.
Can you, as I say,
yes. Can you bring to light some decisions and some reforms that the UK Parliament and even the minister proposed in the last few years
We've had a lot of those. We had a very radical prime minister from the right called Margaret Thatcher 30 years ago. in her first 100 days, she cut income tax dramatically for wealthy people to try and get the economy going. It was very controversial, but she felt she had a mandate. That the public wanted her to do it, and that she could do it straight away with no hesitation. We had, usually what happens in our country is a government comes in and has a emergency budget in which they revisit the public spending balance, and that's their moment to make these decisions. And with the current government in our country, the new Prime Minister came in and immediately made some decisions about Brexit, the way that Brexit was going to be conducted. So you do have even your opponents who don't like your politics usually give you the right to set the agenda in that first 3 or 4 months. And it doesn't matter how close the election is, you still have that right. I mean, the famous example is George Bush, who won by a smallest margin in Florida, if you remember it, in 2000. But despite the fact that he only won by a small amount, he still had authority for a very short period to do what he liked and set his priorities. So it's the same everywhere, that phenomenon, I think. I think there is a sense that if you're in Congress and your party hates the president, the public have voted for the president, and even your voters expect you to give that president a chance to set the agenda. I think that respect for the office is really important in a democracy.
Good. And another subject on transition is the team building of the government, the team that is going to run the government. Well, right now, some Brazilian leaders are building their teams, considering some competences, some backgrounds, and also the politics of the government. So, and what tips or what good practices do you could share with us about it?
Well, a very important part of coming to office as a president, for example, is you have a number of jobs to fill, and filling them with your supporters is an important part of politics, because supporters expect to be rewarded for support. I'm not saying that's corrupt, I'm just saying that's a normal part of politics. But I think the bigger challenge is you need to have technical people in your team who may not have any particular political view, digital expertise, accounting expertise, scientific expertise. And you need to find ways of recruiting people outside of your true believers who you've won the election with, who have specific skills that you need. The second really important thing is you have to be able to employ your enemies. People maybe in the other part of your party who've been fighting in a primary campaign against you before, or even people from the opposition party, particularly when you've had a divided election, a divisive election. You need to show that you can reach across and give jobs to people from different parties. That's a really difficult thing to do. After the Obama-Clinton primary rivalry, Obama decided to give lots of jobs to the Hillary Clinton team when he became president. And it caused huge arguments inside his own team. But reaching out to those enemies within your own party or enemies across other parties, I think is an important part of being not just a candidate, but being a president of a country.
In the transition government, we have some actors that are playing some roles. We have at a side, the politicians, the public managers in the other. And in your point of view, what is the role of each one of them during this process?
Well, I think the politician's job is to translate the election campaign into a policy agenda. And by policy agenda, I mean for each department, 3 or 4 key policies that you want to make progress on. And in my experience, not just in Britain but elsewhere, good officials in government, whatever their own views about the candidates and their own politics, they want clarity of instruction. They want to be told, here are the things that I really want to make progress on. I want these to be the priorities. Of course, I'll make other decisions, but these are the things that I want you to. That for me is the key thing politicians need to do with officials, and they need to tell them what they want. From officials' point of view, I think there is there is a lot of work that goes into the moment that they first meet the new minister. There is a lot of preparation. In the UK, we have a good system of each department prepares a very big a book of how the department works, how the money is allocated, controversial issues that have come up, and also their assessment of how the new minister wants to make progress. So I think the officials need to open the books of their department to the new minister and to be prepared to be told to do things directly different from what they were doing 2 months before. And that's quite a difficult thing to do, I think, because you become connected with a policy that you own. And I think psychologically it's very difficult for officials to suddenly move to a different position and write speeches or briefing notes which make the opposite points to the ones you're making before. But that's part of the professional ethos of being an official in a system where you can have a change of government without changing the regime. So that's a core part of the job, it seems to me.
Very good. I'll take this, your last speech, to connect with our partnership between Oxford and the CLP. What is the relevance of the work we do in developing leaders and developing competences, and also the exchange that we are doing between our knowledge and experiences in our international module in Blavatnik?
Well, the first thing to say is that I'm sure there's a view in Brazil that Britain is like an older democracy, a more stable democracy maybe in some historical sense. I promise you there is no institution doing what the Centre for Public Leadership, the CLP, does here in Brazil, in the UK. There is nothing like it. I was really struck by how you have an organisation that looks at leadership, sometimes in politics, sometimes amongst officials, across political parties, bringing people together from different regions and different levels of government. That really is quite a special thing to do. And this election, you need it more than ever, right? More than ever, you need that collective wisdom and sharing of knowledge and sharing of confidence about how to manage change. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we're in the early stages. I think it will be a good long-term partnership with Oxford. We have the Blavatnik school where I teach is a new public policy school. It's the first one in Oxford that's ever existed. And we are much more focused on producing good governors, people who work in government, either as politically or as officials. And we draw from people all across the world. So one thing this partnership, I hope, can produce is frequent visits from Brazilians connected to the CLP to Oxford to meet people from across the world who have similar challenges to them. I think that's the real, Oxford is a sort of opening for the rest of the world in a funny way, more than it is an opening for the UK specifically. So that's my hope. And anything that brings me to Brazil is good for me as well. So I'm very happy about that side of the partnership as well.
I'm so glad to hear that.
Definitely.
Thank you very much for our conversation.
Very welcome.
Thank you. Brought to light some important points about transition and the way the differences between our countries and the way you see this, your point of view about it. So thank you very much. Eu sou Heron de Carvalho, líder CLP, e acabei de conversar com o professor Stuart Wood, da Blavatnik Escola de Governo do Reino Unido, sobre transição de governo, o jeito de fazer transição do Reino Unido. Essa entrevista é parte de uma série de entrevistas sobre transição de governo, que o nosso objetivo é levar para os nossos seguidores quais são as melhores práticas e formas de olhar para a transição, para que possam construir um governo de excelência. Muito obrigado, sigam os nossos canais no YouTube, Instagram e Facebook.